Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Drifter. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books I read in July. I had a pretty solid reading month and read some really good books. I think they're all horror in one of its many forms, and I did also take part in the Horrorin24 Readathon. This was a 24-day readathon. It was hosted by Carol Marie Reads, Crystal Visions, Marcy Reads and Bruise and Binds. I will leave all of their channels linked below, so definitely go check them out. And yeah, this was a fun readathon. I did read a couple of books before the readathon started, so I'll talk about those first. And first up is Deliver Us from Evil by Alan Lee Harris. This is a reprint from Capricorn Literary of a book that came out in the 80s originally, and this was a really awesome read. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. I have a separate review video for it, so I'll leave that linked below if you want to hear more of my thoughts. But to give you a rough idea, this is set in a small town in the south, and there was a young girl that went missing, and the story then picks up some years later and something is happening in the town that may be related to what happened back then. So we've got a small town, we've got a dark secret, we've got something called the Snake Well, which is terrifying, we've got a creepy kid, we've got a coming of age element, we have the classic good versus evil, and all of this combined really well and made for a really unique story. I thought his writing was really good, his characters were interesting, and this one had some genuine creeps going on. Like, this book seriously creeped me out in places, so I really enjoyed it and I rated it 4 stars. Next up, I read The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle, and I read this as a buddy read with my friend Emily, and we both absolutely loved it. This is a retelling of an H.P. Lovecraft story, The Horror at Red Hook, and Victor LaValle is a black author who has taken that story and turned it into a black narrative, and it was so expertly done. I'd heard good things about this, but yeah, it really was an excellent read, really well written, and there are so many layers to it that the fact that it's about 150 pages long, it's pretty astounding to what he managed to cram into such a short page count. So this is about a character who lives with his father in Harlem, New York in the 1920s, and he is, just working whatever jobs he can get in order to keep a roof over their heads. And a couple of these odd jobs he takes end up leading him to discover some very strange things. And yeah, I won't say too much more than that, but on the one hand, this was just a really great story in and of itself, and on the other hand, the retelling aspect of it was really quite amazing. One thing I will say about this is, if you've never read any Lovecraft before, you can still definitely enjoy this for what it is. You don't necessarily have to have that knowledge of where it comes from, but I do think if you have read some Lovecraft, you will definitely get a lot more out of this than you would otherwise. I'm definitely no Lovecraft expert. I've read a handful of his stories over the years, and I read The Horror at Red Hook before diving into The Ballad of Black Tom. I think having that context definitely made me get a lot more out of this than I would have otherwise. There are obviously a lot of references to that whole world that you're just not going to pick up on otherwise, and because of that, yeah, I got so much more out of this reading experience, and it was great. This was really well written. It had a few really well done creepy moments. It was also quite emotional in places. One in particular was definitely very impactful. This also features commentary on racism and police brutality and stuff that is still happening today. So it is very timely in that respect and really added a lot of depth and meaning to the story. This was excellent. I rated it 4 stars. I highly recommend checking it out if you haven't already, and I definitely want to read more by this author. Then I read Revenge by Yoko Ogawa. This was translated by Stephen Snyder, and it's a collection of short stories. They are all dark and unsettling in some way, and I thought they were excellent. I think my favourite was actually the first one in the collection, called Strawberry Shortcake. It's about a woman who visits a bakery in order to pick up strawberry shortcake for her son's birthday. This one was, a great introduction to the collection, and also for me a great introduction to her work and her writing, because it's the first thing I've read by this author. It was, mysterious and unsettling and dark and really well written. And the whole collection has quite an interesting format in that each story has something related to a previous story, whether that be a thing or a person or a location. So it was really cool how they all tied together in some way, and once you'd read one story and you realised the connection, you could tie it back, and then it made you think more about the other story as well and how the two connected. So that was really interesting. I don't know if I've seen that done before, but I really liked it. And there were a couple of stories that were still good but maybe didn't stand out to me quite as much as others. But overall, a really great collection. It's hard to say too much more about it with them being short stories, but I just liked the overall tone of these. It seemed quite kind of cold and detached, and I think all of the characters here had something dark going on, and a lot of them, it was about kind of revealing what people are capable of, and what dark and unsettling things people can do to other people. So really interesting and a really good collection. I rated this 4 stars, and another author that I look forward to reading more by. I also read The Diary by Jessie Harris. This is book 4 of the Power series, which is a 90s YA series about teenage psychic Mackenzie Gold, and this one involved a friend of Mackenzie's who dies by suicide. So that's a big topic here. If that's something you wouldn't want to read about, then I would avoid this one. I've also read books 1, 2 and 3 of the series so far and really enjoyed them. It's just a fun, entertaining type of book, and while this one was dealing with a serious subject matter, it also had some more fun and lighter elements which kind of balanced it out, but while not detracting from the seriousness of that. So it actually dealt with that really well, I thought, especially for the time period. It could have been handled a lot worse. A lot of things from that time period can be seen as quite insensitive now, so I actually thought this was done pretty well. So I don't have a ton to say about this one, but I did really enjoy it. I ended up rating it 4 stars. And another interesting thing though was I actually think this book was meant to be book 1 of the series. It felt like this story was setting up Mackenzie's psychic powers, whereas in the 3 other books that I've read it's already somewhat established, whereas this one it was introduced as the story went on. And then the other thing, which was quite a big giveaway, is that in the other 3 books Mackenzie has a boyfriend, Aidan, but she doesn't actually meet him until this book, book 4. So I am convinced that this was meant to be book 1. I can only imagine that maybe the theme of suicide made the publishers rethink starting off a series with that, and they just kind of switched around the order of the books. But yeah, kind of interesting, and it doesn't really matter too much because they are basically standalone stories, but just involving the same characters, so it didn't make too much difference, but it was definitely something I picked up on and just thought was kind of interesting. Okay, so the rest of the books I read this month were for the Horrorin24 readathon, and the first prompt was to read a book with red on the cover, and I went with Prodigal by Melanie Tem. I also doubled up, and this book was my choice for read a psychological horror story too. This is about 11-year-old Lucy. She is one of, I think it was 7 children in a family, and the oldest kid, Ethan, who was in his teens, he had gone through a bit of a rebellious phase. He started taking drugs and acting out, and at some point he went missing and they haven't seen him since. And the second oldest child, Ray, she is, I think, 13 going on 14. She is also starting to go through some similar things that Ethan did, and Lucy, the 11-year-old, is worried that her sister Ray is going to go missing, but is also worried that, being the third child, she will be next. This is all told from her perspective, and the idea of an 11-year-old narrator isn't something that would ordinarily maybe attract me to want to read it, but I thought this was really well done. I really liked her voice. I thought it was very believable. There is a lot of day-to-day, normal, maybe boring stuff that goes on here, but then there are also these big topics, these dark topics that she's dealing with as someone so young, and then there are also her, you know, we're hearing her innermost thoughts and musings, and yeah, some of them get quite strange. So I would definitely class this as psychological horror because of that, and I thought it was really well done. This definitely does go into a pretty dark and sinister place that I wasn't necessarily expecting it to go in from the beginning. I do have a separate review video for this one too, so I'll leave that linked below if you want to hear more of my thoughts. Yeah, I thought this one was excellent too. I definitely want to read more by her as well. I rated this one 4 stars. The next prompt was to read a haunted house or ghost story, and I chose Slade House by David Mitchell, and I also paired this up with another prompt, which was to read any horror book that has been on your TBR for a while, because yeah, this one was. So this one is about a door in an alleyway that appears only every so often, and it will only appear to specific people, but when that happens they enter through this small door and they find Slade House. And the only problem is that no one ever really seems to leave Slade House. This was a pretty good read. I did have kind of a mixed experience with it. I thought it had some really great elements, and then some other things that I guess fell a bit flat for me. But I really liked the format of the book. It's told over different time periods as specific characters encounter this door and Slade House. I thought they were really well done. I thought all of those characters were really well fleshed out. I really enjoyed their stories, and yeah, the more that is revealed about what's going on in Slade House, yeah, it was an interesting concept. There is some humour in here as well, which I enjoyed, and a lot of just really great details. Like one chapter in particular I think was set in the 90s, and there's like a party going on, so there was a lot of songs mentioned that, you know, I definitely recall from that time period. So yeah, I thought it had a lot of great details like that that really helped set the scenes over these different time periods. I think the things that didn't quite work for me was the antagonists are a brother and sister, and while the concept for them and their backstory was interesting, I found the characters themselves to be very flat and just not particularly compelling. And I think the other thing was the direction that the story went and the ending itself, not giving any spoilers, but that didn't quite live up to, I think, the story that was building up to those things, if that makes sense. I enjoyed the build-up more than I did the ending. So this was still a good read, even though it wasn't 100% satisfying. I would still recommend checking it out if it sounds interesting to you. I ended up rating this one 3.5 stars. The next prompt was to read a book featuring supernatural creatures like zombies, vampires, etc. And for that I chose Phantom by Thomas Tessier. This was originally published in, I believe, 1982, and I wasn't entirely sure if this did involve a phantom or what, but I still would think it would class as fitting this prompt. I really enjoyed this one. It was such a great read. It's about a young boy called Ned. Ned is, I think, 9 or 10, and he and his parents have moved out of the city to a small town on the coast, and they think it's going to be good for all of them to get away from city life and have a bit more space, etc. And Ned still has these ideas of, you know, phantoms and monsters and stuff like that, as I think a lot of kids at that age do, and moving into this old house kind of adds to those ideas for him, and he believes that there really is something that one night is going to kill him. And this thing is kind of hard to define. It's more of an entity, and it can kind of get in your mind. It can play on your fears and lure you into, I guess, basically falling victim to it, which I thought was really, really interesting and really well done. And if you're thinking that sounds a bit like It by Stephen King, just know that It came out in 1986 and Phantom came out in 1982. So yeah, definitely don't dismiss it if you think it's just an It ripoff. I really, really dug this one. I thought it was wonderful. It had some really great creepy moments. There is an abandoned building in the town which Ned explores, and all of that was fantastic. There was one scene in particular involving spiders, and I am not a spider fan, unfortunately. I'm not ashamed to admit that they scare me. So yeah, that scene was really effective. So yeah, this was awesome. I definitely recommend it, and I rated it 4 stars. Okay, the next prompt was to read a gothic horror novel, and I chose Wylding Hall by Elizabeth Hand. This is about a British folk band in the 70s, and they have had one album out, and they are now working on more music for a second album, and yeah, just really trying to make it big within the music world. And wow, it's really raining right now quite hard, so if you can hear that noise in the background, yeah, that's the weather. So this book is told in a really interesting format. It's told purely in interviews with the band members and a couple of other related people, like the manager and a journalist, and yeah, a couple of other people involved in the story. So it's told in the present day, looking back on this period in the 70s when the band went to live in this big kind of estate called Wylding Hall. It's a really old mansion, and they have the place to themselves for the entire summer to work on songs and yeah, do some recording. So something happened during their time at Wylding Hall, and yeah, as the interviews progress, we slowly find out what happened and why the band kind of broke up at this point and dispersed. and all that they had to show for it was this album that they did record during their time there. I think this was a really great mix of gothic and supernatural and a bit of folk horror in there as well. So yeah, I really enjoyed a lot of elements here. I definitely found it to be a captivating and compelling read, and yeah, was just so curious about where this story was going to go. Unfortunately for me, I think it kind of lost its way a little bit towards the end, and yeah, without giving any specific spoilers, I just didn't find the way it ended to be completely satisfying, which was a bit of a shame, but overall it was still an enjoyable read and I really enjoyed the concept of it, so I would still recommend it. I ended up rating this one 3.5 stars. And the last prompt was to read your favourite childhood spooky story, and the Whole Point horror series was my favourite, so I just went with one of those and I chose Beach House by R.L. Stine because I remember really enjoying this one back in the day and have only a vague recollection of what it was actually about because it's been a while. And yeah, I really enjoyed revisiting this one. It is about a group of teenagers, of course, who are spending the summer at the beach, and of course some spooky things happen. And this one had a unique element, which was that it was told over 2 different time periods. So it actually starts off in the 1950s and then also picks up in the present day / the 90s. And yeah, it kind of goes back and forth between the two, slowly revealing the story. And yeah, I won't say any more about it, but I really enjoyed this one, and yeah, it was just still a really fun and entertaining read, perfect for summer, and I rated it 4 stars. So that was everything I read in July. Like I said, had a pretty good reading month, and I'm glad I joined in with the Horrorin24 readathon. That was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed all of the books I ended up choosing for the prompts, so that is awesome. Let me know if you've read any of these. I would love to hear your thoughts on them, or let me know if you've read anything great recently. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!